look at how easy it is to switch between different breakpoints in Webflow. You can even resize the canvas to see the full range of that breakpoint. And you can even add 3 more for larger screens. This feature alone allows you to create responsive websites in Webflow really easily, of course, without writing a single line of code. And this is exactly what you'll learn in this course. I'm Adi for Envato Tuts Plus, and we're gonna cover this topic in 2 chapters. First, we'll have a closer look at the default breakpoints, how to switch between them, and also how the style changes we make will cascade down to the smaller screens. Then we'll add some breakpoints for bigger screens, and we'll see how the changes we make will actually cascade up. We'll talk about overriding styles between breakpoints and also how to clear those overrides. And we'll close this first chapter by exploring preview mode and also canvas scaling for working with big breakpoints. Moving on to the second chapter, we'll look at 3 best practices for creating responsive websites with Webflow. And here we'll learn about using the proper units, about working with the grid system or the grid layout, and also about the best way of hiding elements between breakpoints. And before we get into all that good stuff, here's something that you might be very interested in. Envato Elements offers all the creative digital assets you need under one subscription. Customize your project today by adding unique photos, fonts, graphics, and themes. For more information, check out the links in the video description. All right, now let's kick things off by taking a closer look at the default breakpoints. Before we get started, thanks for watching. If you want to support this channel and see more content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our community. Now, just like CSS, Webflow uses breakpoints to create responsive websites. But what exactly is a breakpoint? Well, it's quite simple. A breakpoint is the point at which the content and layout of a web page will adjust to accommodate a different screen size or device. For example, this page header looks just fine until the viewport size is around 990 pixels. If we go any lower, the layout will start having issues. So this is the point where we need to make a change. 990 pixels will be our breakpoint. Now, in CSS, you would use media queries for this, but in Webflow, because it's a visual tool and you don't have to write any code, well, you would do things a bit differently. Let me show you. So when you create a new project in Webflow, you get access to 4 default breakpoints, right? You have this one called desktop, which is the base breakpoint. It's the one with the star on it, right? This is where you start. And then you have 3 smaller breakpoints, or 3 breakpoints for smaller devices. You have one for tablet, that's 991 pixels and down. You have this one, which is 767 pixels and down. And so this is for mobile landscape, and this mobile portrait is 478 pixels and down. And while you're inside the designer, you can easily switch between breakpoints by clicking on them, and the canvas here will resize automatically to fit that breakpoint range. Now, what do I mean by range? Well, let's say we're on the base breakpoint. If we grab the handle here and we resize, you can see that this breakpoint has a range of 992 pixels, which you can see here in the lower right corner, up to 1279. And here's something else that's really cool. This will actually snap to common device sizes. So for example, when we get to 1024, this is the width, the resolution basically for the iPad Pro, the Galaxy Tab S3, and the Surface Pro 3 in portrait mode. And we can go higher than that. And when we get to 1279, we get to the Retina MacBook and the MacBook Pro earlier 13-inch models. So this is really cool, really nice piece of information by Webflow to give us this insight. So this is the range of the base breakpoint, the desktop breakpoint. If we go to the tablet, right, this is going to have a different range. It's going to go from 768 pixels, which matches, the iPad Pro, the iPad Air and Air 2, and the Microsoft Surface, and a few others. And we can scale that up to 991 pixels, right? What's above 991 pixels will move to the desktop, right? 992 is the lower limit for the desktop. So as you can see, we go from small to bigger to bigger to bigger, and this is the default desktop. Another easy way to switch between these breakpoints is by using the number keys. So 1 is going to switch to the first breakpoint you have here, 2 to the second, 3, 4, 5, and so on. You can switch between these really easily using the 1, 2, 3 keys. Now, one thing that you'll quickly learn when using these breakpoints is that any change you make will cascade down to the smaller screens. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here I have this hero section, right? And if we look at the spacing, we have 16 rems on the top margin and on the bottom margin. And if we look at the other devices, yeah, we have the exact same values. So on tablet, again, we have 16 and 16. On mobile landscape, 16 and 16. And mobile portrait, again, 16 and 16. Now, watch what happens if I change these values. All right, so let's change the top margin to, let's say, 10 rems. And the bottom margin, again, to 10 rems. So I made this change on my base breakpoint, the desktop. But now if I go to the tablet, that's updated as well, right? It's 10 rems. 10 rems here, 10 rems here. And now if I go, for example, on mobile landscape, and I make a change, let's say I want 5 rems, top and bottom, right? The mobile landscape and the one below it will have 5 rems, but the others will still have 10 rems. And that's because, as I said, changes will cascade down. In this case, it's going to cascade from the base breakpoint to the right side, so from the left to the right. It's going to go from desktop to tablet to mobile landscape to mobile portrait. And again, if I make a change here, it's going to go to this one and then to this one. But the one before it will not be affected, right? It cascades down. And this holds true for anything that's style related, right? So if, for example, on the tablet, I want to make this text a bit smaller. Let's say I want to use 4 rems instead of 7 rems, right? I'm going to make this change on the tablet and below, but not on the base breakpoint. That still has the 7 rem value. All right, so we saw that by default, there are 4 default breakpoints, right? We have the base breakpoint and then 3 smaller ones: tablet, mobile landscape, mobile portrait. But what about bigger screens? What if we want to create different layouts for screens that are bigger than the default desktop breakpoint range, right? Well, Webflow has you covered because we can add up to 3 extra breakpoints. Let me show you. So I've already added one here. This is 1280 pixels and up. But if I want to add the extra 2, I just click on these 3 dots and I can add larger breakpoints. One for 1440 pixels. Click that, create. and one for 1920 pixels. Again, click and create. And now that option is gone. The option to add larger breakpoints is gone because these are the only 3 extra breakpoints that you can add. So now in total, we have 1, 2, 3 large breakpoints. We have the base breakpoint, and then 1, 2, 3 breakpoints for smaller devices. So in total, 7 breakpoints. And just like I showed you before, it's really easy to switch between them using the keys 1 through 7. So 1 represents this one, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I can easily switch between these at will. Now, earlier in the introduction, I told you that some changes will actually cascade up and some will cascade down. And I showed you how they cascade down previously, right, for smaller screens. If we make a change here, it's going to cascade down to the other breakpoints. If we make a change here, it's going to cascade down to the right side. But here's the thing, when working with bigger breakpoints, like these 3, any change that we make to the base breakpoint and up will actually cascade to the left, right? It will cascade up. So what does that mean? Well, let's take again the hero section that we created, right? It has 10 rems, margin top and margin bottom. And if we look at the other bigger breakpoints, that value is preserved, right? But if I change this base breakpoint to, let's say, 12 rems on the top, 12 rems on the bottom, that change will cascade up to the bigger breakpoints. It will cascade to the left side, right? Of course, it will also cascade down to the others. Apart from here, where we made an override, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So changes starting from the base breakpoint, right? They will cascade to the left and to the right. Another example here would be the header container, right? So for example, we have 4 rems of padding left, padding right. So if I change this, let's say on this second big breakpoint, right? Let's change this to 5 rems, right? So that change is visible here, 5 rems, 5 rems. It's also visible here, but on the base breakpoint, it's still at 4 rems. Another change, let's say this logo spacing, right? I'm using Flexbox here, and I set a gap of 4 rems between these elements. So if I go, for example, here to this breakpoint, let's say I want the gap to be bigger here. So I'm going to say 6 rems. That value of 6 rems will be, or will cascade up to this breakpoint, but the others before it will still retain the old value of 4. And before we wrap up this section, you might ask, well, can we add custom breakpoints? Like, let's say I want more breakpoints than what I have here. And the answer is no, you cannot. You can do that by writing some custom CSS, so writing your own media queries, by using the custom code functionality, but that requires a paid plan. But from the interface, from here, you cannot add custom breakpoints, at least at the time of this recording, which is, May 2023. But from my experience so far with Webflow, these 7 breakpoints are plenty for whatever project you might have in mind. Now, previously, I showed you how styles can cascade between breakpoints, and that's great. That's how CSS works. But most of the time, you will need to override some of those styles in different breakpoints. Let me show you how you can do that. And to demo, let's use this H3 element, right? Which by default has a font size of 59 pixels and a line height of 72 pixels. And of course, this is exactly the same in the smaller screen sizes as well, because changes cascade down, as I said. Now, I might get to a point where I'll need to override these changes, and I can easily do that by selecting the breakpoint that I want. For example, in tablet, I want this text to be a bit smaller. I want it to be 51 pixels in font size. And when I get to any of the phones, I need this to be 35 pixels. And also, I'm going to use 48 as a line height. And by doing that, I basically made an override. So I started with this style, 59 and 72. And then on tablet, I made an override. And I can see the override by the blue color of the text. So where it says size, yeah, if it's blue, it means an override. If it's orange, like this, then as you can see here, the value comes from the two classes that I'm using here in Webflow. But the blue tells me that, hey, this is an override. It's no longer inheriting values from the two classes, but instead it's using its own value. And the same goes for this one, the mobile style. Right here, I made two overrides, one for size, one for height. Now, if at any point I decide, okay, I made a mistake, I want to undo that override, right? I want that particular element to inherit the styles that I set previously in the bigger breakpoints. I can do that very easily by clicking on the blue property here and clicking reset. And that brings it back to 51 pixels, which is the value that it's currently being inherited from here, from the tablet, right? And I can do the same for the height, right? I can even use Alt-click directly. And that's going to revert it back to the value that was inherited. In my case, from, as I said, the tablet. And that's how you can clear overrides. And of course, this works in the bigger screens as well, just in the opposite direction. All right, so if we look at this, this main header container, I made an override here for the padding. So in the base breakpoint, I'm starting with 4 rems, 4 rems. But here I changed it to 5 rems, 5 rems. I can option click and I can go back to the previous value. In this case, I cleared an override. But I can go to this breakpoint and say, okay, maybe I want this to be even larger, right? So maybe I'm going to do 8 rems here and 8 rems here. Again, this is an override. I've overridden the values that were being inherited from the previous breakpoint. And those values, of course, will be passed on. They will cascade up to the other breakpoints. All right, now it's time to talk about the preview mode. And engaging preview mode will basically take you out of design mode and allow you to preview the final web page, right? Let me show you what that's doing. The preview mode can be activated by clicking this button here, toggle preview. Right, that's going to hide most of the designer. We still have this bar on the top, but this can also be collapsed by clicking that button, giving you a full view of your page. And you'll notice a couple of things here. So while you're in the designer, when you're hovering on a specific element, you'll get a frame around it showing you the boundaries of that element and also the type of element and the classes. And of course, when you select an element, it becomes highlighted. You have some additional options and so on. But when you enter preview mode, none of that is available to you. You can select elements just like you would in a web page, and you're basically allowed to preview this like you would in the browser without the designer functionality. Another thing that you can do here is completely resize this, right? Or resize it without any kind of limits. If you remember in the designer here, when you had a breakpoint selected, you could only resize this to the boundaries or to the range of that breakpoint. But in preview mode, this is now fully unlocked. You can resize this to your heart's content. And of course, you can still switch between the different breakpoints here, either with your mouse or with the keyboard. But now, yeah, free range of motion for this. So yeah, the preview mode is definitely a great addition because it allows you to see, how the elements will appear on the published site without actually leaving the designer. And one added benefit here is that in preview mode, you can also see how your animations will play on the published site, something that you cannot do in the designer. Now, one last thing before we wrap up this chapter. You see, working with the base breakpoint and lower is typically okay in most situations because you'll have enough room on your screen to fit the entire range of that breakpoint. But what if that's not the case? What if you're working on a smaller screen, let's say a laptop, but you want to work on bigger breakpoints, right? So you want to style larger screens that in resolution are larger than your laptop screen. Well, that's where canvas scaling comes in. Let me show you how that works. So let's assume that I need to work on this website in the largest possible breakpoint, which is 920 pixels and up. The resolution of this screen, or the space that I have here for the canvas, is smaller than 1920 pixels. So what happens is that Webflow will actually scale my canvas to 71%, right? It's going to make everything in the canvas smaller so that it will fit inside this 1920 pixel width. And if I'm going to change this to say 2500, right, it's going to scale it even further to allow me to see the entire content in a 2500 pixel screen. So I hope that makes sense. Now, if I'm going to change this to 100%, it doesn't work, right? Because Webflow will always keep this fixed so that I get the best viewing experience. And I can even drag the side here to make it as wide as I can. So this is apparently the maximum, 5972 pixels, and it's scaled down to 22.8%. Let's see. Does it go further? It does. 10,000 pixels. So yeah, this is a great addition in Webflow, or a great feature in Webflow. If you don't have enough room on your screen, let's say, I don't know, you're working on a laptop screen, something like that. Yeah. And, the tablet breakpoint looks okay. The tablet range, you can fit it in your viewing area here. But if you go to the desktop, oops, it's a little bit too big for your laptop screen. So Webflow will make the scaling. And of course, as you go higher and higher, it's going to scale things even more. It really depends on what kind of room you have to work with on your screen. So there you have it, pretty much everything you need to know to create responsive websites in Webflow. Now, to help you even further, I want to also show you 3 best practices. That's coming up. And for best practice number 1, we'll have a closer look at units. More specifically, I would recommend you steer away from using the px or the pixel unit. As you may know, this is called an absolute unit because what you see is what you get, basically. A dimension set in pixels is the same regardless of screen size, device. And instead, I would recommend you use more, let's call them responsive or relative units, like percentages, ems, rems, vh, vw. Let me show you what I mean. So let's take this this hero element, right? And let's set a width for it at 800 pixels. Yeah. So 800 pixels will mean the hero will actually stay at 800 pixels regardless of the screen size. And obviously we don't want this, because on this bigger screen, the hero should be bigger, right? It should scale according to the available screen. Instead, because I set the width to pixels, it's just this small element in the middle. So what we can do here is use any of the following units. First of all, if we say 100%, that's 100% of the parent width. And in the case of our hero, the parent is the body element, right? So now the hero will be as wide as the body element. That's what 100% means. Maybe I don't want it to be 100%. Maybe I want it to be like 3/4 of the hero, right? 75%. So now its width will be 3/4 of the available body width. Another unit you might want to use is VH and VW. So if I say 75 VW, that's going to be exactly the same, but it means 75% of the viewport width, while percentages refer to the parent width, VW refer to the viewport width. It's a small distinction there. And to show you actually that distinction, let me quickly add like a background color to this element, right? And let me set that to 100%. And let me set the parent element to have a width of 75%. Okay, so what happens now? The parent, which is the gray box, has a width of 75% of the parent element, right? And as you can see, it scales with it. And the red box has a width of 100% of its parent, which means it scales with its parent. If I make the parent bigger, the red box scales with it. However, if I set the width of the red box to 75% or 75 viewport width, well, that's a different story, because now the width will be in relation to the viewport dimension, to the viewport width, not its parent element, right? So that's the distinction that you need to make. So let's quickly undo these changes here. So VW, VH, these are all units that are relative to the viewport size. VW, viewport width, VH, viewport height. Now, another unit that you might consider using instead of pixels is the M unit. And M is a relative unit to the font size of the element. So for example, if I select this button, I have a font size set to it at 21 pixels. And if I select the text, the size is set to 1M. 1M in this case is 1 times the font size of the parent, which is 21 pixels. So the text here is rendered at 21 pixels. If I change the size here to 2Ms, the font size will be 21 times 2. So why is this important? Well, let's say that I'm going to change the font size of the parent. I'm going to make it 50 pixels. So the text changes along with it, but the padding stays the same, which looks wrong, right? If I change the font size of this button to this really big value, the padding inside the button should also change. So instead, what I can do, let's go back to 21 pixels, and I can change the padding values. Instead of using rems here, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I can change them to M's. So 1.5 M's, 1.5 M, 3M, and 3M. So now what happens, if I change the size back to 50 pixels, you'll see that the button scales completely, right? The text gets bigger and also the padding gets bigger. So that's the power of M's. Now, what about rems? Well, rems are just like M's in the sense that they're relative to the font size, but the rem is relative to the root font size, which means the HTML document, right? While the M is relative to the font size of the parent element. So to give you an example, this heading 1, we can change the font size to rems, let's say 7 rems, okay? And this one has a size set in pixels. So this is an absolute value, this is a relative value. Now watch what happens if I go into the canvas settings and I change the base font size. I change this to 24 pixels. Notice this text gets bigger, while this one stays the same, even if I make it bigger here or smaller. So why is that? Well, that's because this text is using pixels. So it's going to stay at this dimension regardless of the font size of our HTML document. But this H1, because it has a size of 7 rems, it's going to be 7 times the font size of the body element. In my case, it's 24 pixels. So 7 times 24 pixels. So it's going to get bigger or smaller. It depends on what kind of value I have. If I set 10 pixels as the base font size, then this H1 will have a size in pixels of 7 times 10, 70 pixels. So that's the difference between using M's and rems. And using rems is actually recommended because some people might prefer that their browsers display a larger font size. So if they change that setting in their browser, then whatever text you used will reference that font size set as the body font size, if that makes any sense. So those are the units that I recommend you use. VW, VH, those are viewport relative units. Percentages, that's relative to the size of the parent. And then M's and rems, those are relative to the font size of the parent element and the body or the HTML element, respectively. And that doesn't mean that you don't need to ever use pixels, right? Pixels still have their uses. For example, on this button, I set a border radius in pixels, right? And I can make this maybe, 8 pixels. So this is actually one of the cases where pixels is recommended. Another place you can use pixels is maybe, I don't know, when you add a box shadow, setting the distance, the blur, the size. Even though you can set these in any unit you want, I usually use pixels for this. When you declare border sizes, right? Again, here I would use pixels instead of anything else. For best practice number 2, I recommend using the built-in grid system in Webflow. This is based on CSS grid layout, and it works really well for responsive websites. Let me give you an example. So let's say that I have 3 features here, right? 3 feature blocks, this, this, and this. And I want to arrange them in a multi-column layout. Of course, I could use Flexbox for that, but a much better option is the grid layout. So the way we do that is we grab a grid from here, we drag it onto our features element, and we can define how many columns, how many rows we want. Let's say I want 3 columns So I'm going to add one more, and I just want one row. Okay, and once I'm done editing, I can click Done. Now what I can do is I can take my feature blocks and I can place them in my grid. How easy was that? So now with the grid selected, I can edit by clicking here. I can set the gap. Let's say I want 48 pixels gap between the columns and also between the rows. I can add multiple rows if I want to. I can make one column bigger than the others, or I can have them all equal. And the nice part is, I can click on the other breakpoints. And when I get to a place where the grid doesn't really look that great, I can select it, right? And I can edit that to say, okay, I just want one column. So now on tablet and down, I have a one column layout. And for the rest, I have a 2-column layout and a 3-column layout on the bigger screens because I have room for it. So the Webflow grid layout, definitely a must-have. I recommend you use this anytime you want to create a multi-column layout. And finally, for best practice number 3, let me show you the best way of hiding elements between breakpoints. And to give you an example, let's say I'm on the base breakpoint, right? And we're looking at the main header here. And you'll see that when I get to kind of the end of this breakpoints range, the menu gets a bit stuffy, right? It's a bit too crowded. I could use a bit more breathing room. So starting with the next breakpoint, you can see this already breaks the layout. Yeah. I would like to hide some of these elements. Let's say I want to hide this, and maybe this vertical separator, right? So what I can do is I can, on the breakpoint in question, I can select these elements and I can go to the layout section here, and under display, I'm going to choose none. Yeah, to hide the elements. Because I'm using a class, it also hid the rest of the elements here, which is totally fine. I can also select this vertical separator. I can hide that as well. Right, so now on smaller screens, I don't have that menu anymore. And I can even show, certain elements. So for example, when I'm on like the tablet here, or maybe here, right? I can hide these and I can show another element. Let's see if I have, oops. Let's see if I have an icon set up here. I don't, but let's use this as an example, right? So maybe put this here, maybe make it just a little bit smaller. Height, let's set it to 32 pixels, something like that, okay? So maybe I want to show this image when I'm on mobile landscape, right? So I'm gonna hide it from here, but I'm going to show it here. All right, so now when we get to the smaller breakpoints, we're hiding that image and we're, showing that image and we're hiding the rest. Very useful for when you want to hide maybe a nav menu, show a menu button, stuff like that. And this is the recommended way because in Webflow, you also have the option, if you go right here, you also have the option to change the visibility of an element, right? So you can make this element hidden. But that's not recommended. Instead, use this option, display. This is actually how you do it in CSS. You set display none to hide an element. And those are 3 best practices you should remember when creating responsive websites with Webflow. Obviously, there is a lot more to discover on this topic, so I trust you'll be doing that in your own time, and you'll be exploring the software to learn like the full range of its capabilities. Speaking of, question for you, what is your favorite Webflow feature? Let us know down in the comments. As always, don't forget to check out the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more content like this, but also to learn about web design, web development, and a whole lot more. It's all free, so make sure to also hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. I'm Adi, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, take care.